I'd like to offer my welcome and to this morning's meeting. This is a voter education program on an extremely important subject that the League has a position on. Your handout indicates what the League's position is on climate change. It's on the back of your handout. Our voter education program is on climate change in Arizona and what can and should we do. Excuse me. We have three distinguished speakers who are local experts on this subject of climate change. Dr. Diana Liverman is Regents Professor of Geography and Development at the University of Arizona. And she is primarily an expert on climate impacts in this area, and climate impacts both what the climate change will be and how it will influence our communities. And our second speaker will be Ed Beshore, who's co-director, co-chair of the Citizens Climate Lobby of Oro Valley, and he will be talking about legislative programs and steps we can take to reduce carbon emissions. And then finally, Kathy Jacobs of the University of Arizona also is an expert and the director of the Center for Climate Adaptation Science, and so she can talk about how our communities can adapt to climate change. So there's more information about their backgrounds on your handout. I will keep this short so that we can maximize the time for their comments. On the back are links. I'd like to direct your attention to these. On links, you can educate yourself more about the subject matter here, and here are sources of more information. And finally, this program is being live streamed on Facebook. So if you would like to review the program, you can go to the Facebook page and see the video. Also, if there are friends of yours who could not attend this program but would be interested in it, please direct them to this source. So, with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Diana Liverman. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for all you do as an organization. I'm going to give a more global overview to the issue of climate change, though I will bring it down to Arizona when I start talking about what we can do. And I won't talk a lot about what's going on within US policy, because Ed is an expert on that. And even though Kathy and I work on adaptation a lot together, I'm going to defer to her expertise talking about adaptation. So did we decide to pop the light down a bit so that you can see the slides better? The lighting's not great for slides here. Okay, I'll be able to describe what's on the slide. So what I'm going to talk about is a report that I was involved with of a group called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And for those of you that are not familiar with IPCC, it's a UN appointed organization, and it is an organization of scientists who on a regular basis, and it's scientists from all over the world, assess what's going on with the climate, what are some of the choices we might have in what we would do about climate change, and they provide reports to the United Nations that then influence some of the international negotiations. And the way you get picked to be part of IPCC is there's a call for, within the US at least, there's a call for nominations from the US government. You submit your CV and why you particularly want to work on the report, and then that all goes off to Geneva and they select authors. So a few years ago, there was a call for people to work on a special report on whether we could keep global warming under 1.5 degrees C, that's 2.7 Fahrenheit. And I thought that sounds like a really interesting report. I'd just stepped down from an administrative position, so I decided to apply, and I was very privileged to be one of the 8 Americans who were chosen to work on the report. The report was released last fall. It got a lot of media attention, which was great because when you work on one of these reports, it takes 18 months to 2 years, and it's all completely voluntary. You do it on top of your day job. You do get funded to go to the meetings, but you don't get paid to actually write the report. So you spend a lot of time on it. So then the fact that the media was interested in our report, that politicians were interested, and groups like you are interested, makes the work seem worthwhile. So it was requested by the UN, and the reason they wanted to know particularly about whether we could keep warming under 1.5 degrees C was, at the time, the UN had a goal of keeping warming under 2 degrees. But a number of countries were worried that 2 degrees centigrade warming would be too much for them. Small islands were worried that that would have so much sea level rise that they would disappear, or that ecosystems would be damaged. And so there was a big push for a 1.5 degree target, but they wanted scientists to tell them whether that target was possible and whether, in fact, you'd save a lot by reducing the target from 2 to 1. Would the losses be significantly less if we could keep warming to 1.5 compared to 2? So the big event was you write the report and it's reviewed by thousands of people. I think we had more than 40,000 review comments, which you have to respond to. And there were about 100 of us who were working on the report. But the final part of the report is a plenary where you have to get the report approved by government negotiators from all the governments in the world. And you sit up there as a scientist for the bit of the report that you're responsible for, and governments can challenge you on what you wrote. They can say that they don't like it, and it's pretty much 7 days non-stop defending your work. And the last 4 days in Korea, we actually worked 24/7. We were awake for 52 hours trying to get the report approved, mostly because one government in particular, the government of Saudi Arabia, was trying to stop us getting the report approved and challenged every single word that we had written. But it did get approved, which was great. So these are the main messages of the report here, and I'm just sort of putting them up here right away. The first was, this was the first IPCC report to confirm that we actually have already increased the global average temperature by 1 degree C compared to pre-industrial levels. And also we looked at current policies worldwide, and if we only stuck with current policies, where would we end up? And we concluded that we would get to 3.5 degrees C by the end of the century. That's 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll come back to that in a minute for Arizona. The second thing we concluded is that every bit of warming matters. We looked at all sorts of, and the way IPCC works is we review the literature. We read everything that's been written since the last report. We don't do original research. But in reviewing the literature, we found article after article that says, yes, there is a difference between 1.5 and 2. 2 is much worse than 1.5, and I'll give you a couple of examples. The third thing that got all the media attention was we looked at what it would take to keep warming under 1.5 degrees. And it's extremely hard. It requires that we cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030 and get to what we call net neutral emissions, which is that any greenhouse gases we emit in 2050 have to be balanced by taking up carbon dioxide, either by land use, planting more trees, or by technologies that could take CO2 out of the air. And then the final thing we looked at as a UN organization were the Sustainable Development Goals, and we concluded that even at 1.5, you undermine some of the efforts of sustainable development, and that is much worse at 2 degrees than 1.5. So the first point I want to make, and I know this is a little difficult to see, so I'll just make the point verbally, which is that 1 degree of warming globally that has already been experienced, that's for the world, the globe as a whole, including oceans and land and Arctic and equator. And 1 degree of warming globally means that some areas have warmed more than that, including this area, because a global average temperature increase is usually higher than the global average over land, in the Arctic, in dry areas, and at night. So the 1 degree of warming is higher here. It's probably nearer to 1.5 degrees. We're already at 1.5 in this area. But also, if you look at what it means in the Arctic, it means very serious warming. And then if you look to the future, when we're talking about a 3.5 degree increase with current policies, that also could be much higher here. So National Climate Assessment, which Kathy will talk about briefly, suggests that we're actually risking temperatures of 6 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit in this area if we allow global warming to continue. We've already observed lots of impacts, and the headline messages from the report was that we're already seeing ecosystems shifting, bird distributions are changing, we're seeing problems with the coral reefs, and then we looked at 1.5 and 2 and what the impact difference would be, and what we found was that if you could limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade, you could save some of the coral reefs, but at 2 degrees centigrade, the tropical corals would disappear. We also found that if you could keep warming to 1.5 rather than 2, you could prevent about half of the habitat loss that would occur at 2 degrees. 1.5 is also better because it halves the number of people exposed to heat stress or to water stress. And also, if you could just reduce warming by that 0.5 degree, you would reduce the risks of sea level rise and of dislocation associated with that. And those are just a few of the differential impacts that basically told us it is worth aiming for 1.5 because we will reduce a lot of losses and a lot of suffering. Oh, that graph disappeared. Okay, I'll leave it. Moving on, just to give you an example of what this means locally, I've tried to show if we take the July average temperature for Tucson, which is 100 degrees right now, where the average AC cost is about $1,500. If warming increases by 1.5 degrees C, we start to have the climate of Casa Grande. If we increase by 2 degrees C, Tucson becomes Phoenix, which a lot of us don't want, and air conditioning increases. At 3.5, which is where we're headed right now, we become Yuma, and air conditioning costs could increase by 1/3 to $500. And in the worst case scenario, we become Death Valley, and I don't know what that would cost. We did conclude that global warming will undermine sustainable development, particularly efforts to eradicate poverty and hunger worldwide, and that's not just globally, it's also in Tucson. The poor here have a really hard time paying for air conditioning in the summer, and just little bits of temperature increase are going to increase their bills, where it starts to cut into people's ability, for example, to feed their children or to pay for water for irrigation. So we then asked, what would it take to keep warming under 1.5? And I'll just talk a little bit about this. As I said, it would require halving emissions by 2030. And what this would require would be shifts in our energy investment away from oil and gas towards renewables. But we weren't trying to be unrealistic. We also estimated economically that it will require an increase in investment as well as a shift as investment. But it's not an impossible increase in investment. It was an increase of about 1/3 in the global energy system. And actually investment and R&D, for example, in this country has been dropping over the last couple of decades in terms of research and development for energy. And then the other thing is that we can only stay under 1.5 if we make a massive investment in carbon sequestration. in getting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by protecting and expanding forests and other carbon sequestering land uses, and if we can come up with technologies that are affordable that could help us take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And our colleagues actually up at ASU are doing quite a bit of research. You may have seen it on Arizona Illustrated, but it's nowhere ready for prime time. In the report, we look at lots of options of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The cheapest always in every report that has been done is energy efficiency. And in our own houses, energy efficiency, it's often like, yeah, I just have to get my act together to replace those light bulbs, or I'm going to buy a new refrigerator, let me get the most efficient I can get. All of those make a contribution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And lots of countries, like China, for example, has dramatically increased its energy efficiency over the last few years, and it's helping slow some of China's greenhouse gas emissions. Reducing energy demand, that's where you turn down your thermostat a couple of degrees, or you don't drive as fast, or in my case, you try not to fly so much. I'm a little hypocritical in terms of what IPCC is. I had to fly to 5 different countries as part of being in the IPCC report, so my carbon footprint last year was pretty embarrassing. We also need to make a rapid transition from fossil fuels, and the IPCC suggests, we concluded that you need the full portfolio. So it's solar and wind, but it also includes hydro, it also includes nuclear, and we also talked about bioenergy, producing liquid fuels from crops or from algae. There are downsides to that because that can take up agricultural or conservation land, but it may be necessary. Protection of forests, dietary changes is mentioned in the report. There were some countries that didn't want us to include comments about moving towards more plant-based diets. We didn't say you have to go vegetarian, we just said reduce the balance of meat in favor of vegetables, and then the technology. So this is just what this could mean, and I just wanted to give a bit of hard data on what it takes to reduce emissions by half, and also to show that it doesn't mean completely getting rid of coal and oil by 2030. It means getting there as fast as we can. So for 2030, to have a good chance of staying under 1.5 degrees, we need to reduce energy demand by 5%. That's actually tough because there's a lot of parts of the world that are coming out of poverty, where people's energy use is increasing in order to give them a decent livelihood. So that might mean that energy demand here needs to be reduced a lot more in order to be fair to the poor of the world. Energy from coal down 60%, oil down 13%, gas down 20%. You can see a significant increase in nuclear energy, but a massive increase in renewables of 470%. So the conclusion of our report is that we shouldn't wait. And it's already been 6 months since our report came out. Our data was from a few years ago. So the longer we wait, we've got to make larger reductions, and we've got to make them faster. If we wait too long, we've got to rely on these untested or controversial technologies like carbon capture and storage or bioenergy that could have trade-offs with agriculture and conservation. And my personal opinion, after having done the report, is that we're actually probably not going to be able to stay under 1.5 degrees. So what I'm thinking about is scenarios where we do what we call temperature overshoot. The temperature might have to go up for a while before it comes down. And that's where Kathy's talk is going to be important. How can we make it through these periods of higher temperatures? Adaptation is much more challenging if we wait. And we will undermine the Sustainable Development Goals, which are designed to eliminate poverty, not just worldwide, but also in Arizona. There were a lot of challenges in writing the report. I'll end with this. We had to write it in 18 months. Most reports you have 4 years, particularly since everybody is a volunteer and you've got to read hundreds and hundreds of scientific papers. It was also challenging because this was very policy relevant. The UN wanted the answer yesterday. Another problem was actually with our colleagues in the academic community. They hadn't actually been writing papers on 1.5 degrees. They've been writing them about 2 degrees and 4 degrees. So we had actually some limited evidence. And we had all these review comments to respond to. So I'll end there, hand over to these two guys, and I'll look forward to your questions in a minute. Thank you.
Speaker is Ed Beshore.
Mine's the LWV version 2.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks.
Thanks very much, Mary. I feel really honored to be up here with Diana and Kathy, who in my mind are the undisputed experts here in Tucson on these topics. So I feel humbled, and I hope that I can live up to the example that they've set. So, climate change, my topic is what can we do about it? Diana's given us, I think, a good introduction to the sorts of issues that we have to address. See, I guess, yes, slideshow.
It's coming, it's coming.
Yeah, all right. There we go. Perfect, thank you very much. So, we've passed an interesting threshold just in the last couple of years here in the United States. The Yale program on climate change communication takes a poll every year to see where Americans are at on the topic. And just recently, we have found that about 70% of Americans believe climate change is real, and almost 60% of them think we need to do something about it. Nearly 50% of Americans are alarmed and want to do something rapidly. So I think the key is that we are ready to make the next transition, start addressing the next big question, which is, what do we do now? The challenge here is that cheap and abundant energy has actually defined the way we live in this country. To give you a good example, it's how we live and work. We live in suburbs and we commute every day, sometimes 10, 15 miles to work and back. We have individual transportation. That's all been made possible by abundant clean energy, but it's also defined the way we live. It defines the way our society has been built. So our challenge really comes, how do we transform ourselves away from that kind of activity, or is there a way that we can replace that abundant clean, or rather that abundant fossil fuel energy with non-polluting renewable energy? Because 80% of the greenhouse gases that we emit come from fossil fuel use. There's just no way to get around it. We have to curtail our use of fossil fuels. If we were to take all of the greenhouse gases that we emit from fossil fuels here in the United States and divide it by the number of people who live here, that would work out to about 16 metric tons per person. That's 2,200 pounds as a metric ton. So that's a lot of CO2. So, as Diana has pointed out, climate change is serious and we ignore it at our peril. We have a big challenge. Our response must be large, it must be systemic, it must touch nearly everything that we touch that gets energy from fossil fuels. So how do we go about doing that? In order to get to the 2-degree mark, we need to slash emissions by about 14 tons per person here in the United States by 2050. That's a rough estimate. But we have more requirements, more than just being effective, more than getting just to that 14 tons of reduction per person. We can't put this on the backs of the poor. This has to be good for people. This has to work out in a way that we don't make it difficult or impossible for the poor to afford their air conditioning or to get to work. We have to make this work for people. It also has to be good for the economy. One of the arguments against doing something about climate change from a lot of sectors has been, we have to wreck our economy in order to solve this problem. I don't happen to believe that that's true at all, but nevertheless, we have to make sure that it's not true. Whatever solution we come up with, we have to be sure that we can make this work for our economy. I happen to believe that these transformations that occur in society from time to time have actually worked out to our advantage. Look at the Industrial Revolution. As we moved from agriculture to the Industrial Revolution, that spurred a huge increase in the size of our economy. Likewise, the change into an information technology society, which transformed us in many, many ways. Some of them we don't particularly care for, but nevertheless, that really has driven our economy in positive ways. I believe that that's also true and will be true for a transformation in the way that we make and deliver energy to Americans. Finally, whatever we come up with, it has to be politically durable. This has to be something that people are willing to do. It has to be something that we can convince our leadership, our political leadership, is doable and that must be done. And furthermore, people have to participate. They have to agree that this is something that we need to be doing. Abraham Lincoln understood this. He said, public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, anything is possible, nothing can fail, but without it, nothing can succeed. So whatever we come up with, it has to be a politically durable solution. So we've looked at a lot of different ways that we as individuals can do something about this. Now, this is kind of an eye chart, and I apologize for that. Does this have a laser pointer? Oops, no.
Yeah, it does. It's the one in the middle.
In the middle, okay, great, thank you. So along this left axis is the emissions savings in metric tons of CO2 per year. And then this bar chart goes along and lists several things that we can do, and I'll just read a few of them. If we can find a way to live without a car, if we use a car right now, if we could find a way to do without it, we could save about 1 metric tons per person. Likewise, if we could, sorry about this, Diana, if we could skip that transatlantic flight, we can save about 1.5 metric tons every transatlantic flight we take. Down at the other end, upgrading our light bulbs, about 0.1 metric tons. The thing to remember, though, is that if you add all of these up, you still don't get to 14 metric tons. And why is that? It's because you could go home and turn off the lights and not go anywhere. And you'd still have a carbon footprint of about 60% of what it is today. Because most of what your carbon footprint consists of are the things that we buy. The food that we eat, the manufactured goods that we purchase, they all have a carbon footprint as well. So we have to affect the production of food, we have to affect the production of manufactured goods, and we have to change things at home. So what kind of public policy solution could cause us to do all of these things and also affect the way American business works? So at the Citizens Climate Lobby, we've been working for about 10 years on this problem. Every year, well, twice a year, we go to Washington, D.C., and we talk to our members of Congress. And this is our latest visit with them in June of last year. 1,200 volunteers showed up. We had 450 meetings with members of Congress in one day. And what we talked to them about is something called carbon fee and dividend. We think it's the quickest way to cut carbon emissions. So what is it? Carbon fee and dividend is really pretty simple. It's based on something you and I appreciate very well. What happens when something gets more expensive? We stop buying so much of it. If it gets too expensive, we start looking for alternatives. So the key with carbon fee and dividend is to put a fee on the carbon content of fossil fuels at the wellhead, the mine, or the border. Wherever the fossil fuels enter our economy, we put a fee on the carbon content of those fuels. We propose to begin with a fee of $15 per ton and then increase that by $10 a ton every year. But we think that the government should not keep that revenue. We think that that revenue should be returned to households as a dividend based on a simple formula, the number of people in the household. That would go to every household in the country. To give you an example, $3,400 per household per year in year 10 of the program. That would be the typical dividend that would be returned. And then a border adjustment to prevent the export of carbon pollution. We would want to ensure that American businesses were not put at a disadvantage for their exported products. And likewise, products that came from countries where no carbon fee was charged, we would charge a tariff to equalize the cost of those products to give American businesses well, to actually ensure that they don't have a disadvantage and to ensure that they continue to have a price advantage when they sell their products overseas. So let's take a look at how this would work. So we would charge $15 a ton for fossil fuel when it comes out of the ground at the extraction point. This is just there's probably around 1,500 businesses that would be affected by this. This is a relatively simple way to do it because there's not too many places where fossil fuels come out of the ground. There's a whole lot of places where fossil fuels get injected into the atmosphere. A lot of tailpipes, a lot of smokestacks. But this makes it a little simpler to get this fee. They would pay $15 a ton, which would go to the US Treasury. Now what would happen? 100% net of costs of getting that money together would be given back to US households. But this would also send an important signal to the marketplace and to individuals. Prices for fossil fuel-based products, manufactured goods as well as energy, would go up. We would find people would work to start consuming less of that. That would be particularly true for businesses that are energy intensive. They would look for alternatives. For instance, a mining company that buys its energy from Tucson Gas and Electric would go to Tucson Gas and Electric and say, we would like to find cheaper sources of energy. We'll either do it ourselves or you can install more renewables in place. It creates a market signal that says fossil fuels are going to get more expensive over time, and your investment made now will pay off because we can guarantee you that your energy is going to be more expensive 1 year, 5 year, 10 years hence. So that sends an important signal to businesses as well as individuals. The other thing it does is it sends a signal to the innovation market, where people and businesses say, I can come up with a more efficient way to use energy and to make energy. I can come up with new, more energy efficient appliances. So investments in those kinds of products would increase. So non-fossil products would become preferred by most consumers, and over time, prices for those would drop. In fact, we estimate that if this program were instituted within a few years, by the late 2020s, we'd actually see a peak in energy prices, and then we would see prices begin to drop because of the innovation that would occur, because of this strong signal that says fossil fuels are going to get more expensive. So it so happens we actually have a bill in Congress right now. It's called House Bill 763, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It's effective. Within 12 years, it would drop the emissions of CO2 by 40%. And the bill is designed to continue raising the price on fossil fuels until the emissions drop by 90%. So the price would continue to go up, and if certain price estimates or if certain emissions goals were not seen, the price would actually rise faster. Most importantly, it's good for people because this dividend ensures that the poor and those who are least capable to cope with the increased prices from higher prices on fuel would not have to pay those prices, because that dividend would actually, for the bottom 40% of the economy, 80% of the people in the bottom 40% of the economy would actually have more money in their pocket at the end of every month than they would have after they have paid for the increased price of fuel. So this really makes sure that, as Diana pointed out, we cannot put this on the backs of the poor. Furthermore, folks have this stimulus that comes along in the form of a dividend, which is good for them, and we're not burning fossil fuels. We estimate 250,000 lives will be saved over the duration of this program from air pollution that will no longer occur because we're not burning fossil fuels. It will be good for the economy. We estimate 2.1 million new jobs will be created over 20 years as a result of this program, and we have economic models that verify this. If you go to the Citizens Climate Lobby website, you can download several models that show the results from the analysis that we've done that show that this is actually good for the economy. Why is it good for the economy? Because you've got this continuous stimulus of the dividend going into communities. In Pima County alone, in year 10, this would account for about $900 million of new money coming into Pima County in the form of this dividend. And finally, it's politically durable. Why? Because this is a bipartisan approach. It has things that appeal to both sides of the aisle. First of all, it's revenue neutral. We do not keep additional dollars in the government as a result of this program. That appeals to conservatives because they're very sensitive about new taxes that go to the government. But likewise, it puts money in people's pockets. So this is a revenue neutral program that actually helps people and actually helps grow the economy. So we believe that when people go to the gas pump, they might see more expensive gasoline, but they're also going to be thinking about that big dividend check that they get at the end of every month. And they know why and what they're going to do with that dividend check. The other thing that's important is that when you start putting cash in people's hands, they're going to look at the gas pump and say, how can I keep some of that money for myself? So they will buy more efficient cars. They will buy more efficient appliances, and then they'll be able to keep more of that money for themselves and use it for other things. And what does our analysis show that they'll use that for? Healthcare. So that would be no big surprise. So what can you do? Well, HR 763 implements the Citizens Climate Lobby Carbon Fee and Dividend proposal. It's in front of the House right now. We are looking for sponsors in the Senate to introduce a version of this bill in the Senate. This is the result of 9 years of work by Citizens Climate Lobby volunteers, but we need you. We need you to call. This is, of course, a great group for actually calling Congress. I shouldn't really have to work too hard at this, I guess. But we need to talk to our Congress people and say, we need to pass this bill. If you're interested in knowing more, just go to citizensclimatelobby.org. There's lots of information about HR 763 there. But if you go to citizensclimatelobby.org/write-your-representative, you can actually write both of your senators and your member of Congress from that website and let them know that you're interested in seeing that this bill gets moved forward. With that, I'll say thank you very much, and I'll look forward to answering your questions.
Good. Kathy, you're on.
Great. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk about solutions. I spend a lot of my time talking to audiences about climate change, in part because of my background working on the U.S. National Climate Assessment, but the center that I direct focuses on the solutions, the adaptation solutions in particular, but in addition, the kinds of things that Ed and Diana have been talking about as well. So soon we will probably have some slides.
We will.
In the meantime, I'll just say a little bit about my background. So I am coming at this whole issue from the perspective of a water manager. I worked here in Tucson as the director of the Tucson Active Management Area for 15 years and for the Department of Water Resources for 23. And only in the last 10 or 15 years got engaged with climate issues. So I've been really focused on solutions to environmental problems for a long time, and this really just was a little bit of an evolution. So I guess I need to clicker. Great. So I'm going to start with just talking a little bit about the U.S. National Climate Assessment, because it is essentially the authoritative source of information for the entire country. It gets updated every 4 years in theory. In reality, it hasn't actually happened that often. But I was privileged to lead the one that was released in 2014. There has been a subsequent one in 2018, so if you want the most recent information, that's where to go. But we were able to move the whole idea of the National Climate Assessment from just writing a report about what do we know and what don't we know and what are the uncertainties, to a place where we're moving into supporting decisions. How can we produce information that's useful for people who are trying to manage risk and trying to understand how climate will affect their opportunities as well? And so you can see there's been a whole series of these reports. In fact, the 2017 report was one just about climate science that formed the basis for the most recent one in 2018. But the reality is, almost all of the science that is in these reports, it just builds from the previous ones. There's been no major shocking turnaround in the science. It's literally, we are understanding more and more and being able to observe more and more about what is actually happening out there. So, unfortunately, what is happening is that there are now impacts that are connected to climate change, observable in every sector, in every region of the United States. And we're seeing it not just in terms of gradual changes, but we're seeing it in terms of extreme events. And that's really how people are affected by climate change, not by just gradual changes, but by things like massive hurricanes or wildfires, etc. So we're starting to understand that there is a big link between what's going on with the climate and these massive changes that come with extreme events. And there have been a series of trends across the country. I'm sure you've all heard about this because you've been following this issue. But heat waves are generally increasing in numbers and intensity. Cold waves are decreasing. More precipitation is coming in the context of extreme events, which means that the more rainfall comes in shorter periods of time, which can actually cause a lot of damage as opposed to being helpful. Increasing risk of floods, of course, associated with that. Increasing intensity of droughts. That's particularly true in the southeast and the southwest. Incidence of large wildfires has increased. This should not be a surprise if you've actually been reading the paper recently. Massive wildfires happening, particularly across the west, but through Canada and Alaska. And then increasing intensity of hurricanes expected and already demonstrated. So I think it's very easy to get lost in all the various things that you hear about climate change. So I have one slide about what is expected for the Southwest. This is just trying to make it easy because people do get a little bit overwhelmed by all of these trends and all this information. So first of all, it's going to get hotter. I think you've already heard that a few times. Stream flow is likely to be reduced, and this is already happening. We've seen it in the Colorado River, but it will happen elsewhere, and that has, of course, a lot of implications for biodiversity and the places that we like to recreate. So that impacts supply, but at the same time, evapotranspiration, or the rate that plants take up water, will increase. And so we've got a demand increase happening at the same time that we have a supply reduction. So drier on average, but we still need to worry about the issue of intense rainfall. So we may have a total of fewer inches of rain per year, but in reality, we could also have some devastating flooding as part of all of this. One of the things that many of us who work on climate adaptation are most concerned about is the issue of cascading impacts. And what we mean by that is things are connected. So energy systems are connected to communication systems, transportation systems require the electric grid to function. You know, there's a whole lot of things that are part of our economy now that are very sophisticated but very linked. And so when you have one piece of a system go down, you could easily see cascading effects across multiple systems. And we've seen this every time there's been an extreme event, unanticipated impacts. They come from the links within systems. We've all noted, I'm sure, that the reservoir levels in the Colorado River are at the lowest level since the reservoirs were filled initially. And we in Arizona have really significant implications because we have the lowest, our allocation of Colorado River water has the lowest reliability because we're the first to be cut when there is a shortage. And as I've mentioned already, but something I'm particularly passionate about is the potential implications for the environment, ecosystems, biodiversity, and of course human health. We're seeing a lot of linkages between increased heat in particular, but a variety of other impacts relating to human health. And we of course need to be thinking about this from the perspective of disadvantaged populations, not just the rest of us who have a lot of advantages. So, looks like I lost a graphic too. But in the Southwest chapter of the NCA4, this 2018 version, there's a graphic that shows, unfortunately I can't share it with you today, the fact that heat that is anticipated going through 2065, as Diana pointed out, there's significantly more heat anticipated in this part of the country than other parts. And I think you've all noted the fact that Colorado River flows have been reducing, but it's happening not just because of reductions in precipitation. It turns out that increases in heat have a lot of effect on flow because of higher evaporation, etc. So you can see that in these graphs. In fact, the upper left one has to do with the flow volume reducing, the lower left is the temperature increasing, but in the lower right, you can see that there hasn't been a really significant change in total precipitation, and yet we're still seeing the river flows reducing. So that's a really important point. The temperature has a big impact on our water supply. And I am about to get done with the bad news part of this story, but there was a recent effort to evaluate sort of where states were in terms of planning for risk. And it does turn out that it matters whether the state itself acknowledges that climate is changing, because then you have to acknowledge that you have to be planning for a different future than the one you have today. And Arizona, although it scored very high in its water management efforts, actually didn't score high in terms of anticipating and preparing for climate change. So what do we have to do to manage climate risk? We have to understand both the likelihood and the consequences of these future events that might occur. We have to understand the intensity and duration of future drivers, and understand the underlying conditions, all the things that make us vulnerable already that might be exacerbated by a change in the climate. There is a nice graphic in this latest National Climate Assessment really illustrating the fact that it is different kinds of stresses that affect different categories of vulnerable populations. And it's very important if you're designing an adaptation process to take into account who is vulnerable to what and why, and how these stressors intersect with each other. So it's a little bit complicated, but you can actually start with a particular population and analyze it rather easily. And then we have to make choices, and I think you've heard from both Ed and Diana what at least the mitigation side of these choices is. Our future depends on how we act to limit climate change, because to the extent we don't manage emissions, we absolutely will be overwhelmed from the perspective of adaptation. But if we take both of these issues together, we actually have a way that is a pretty reasonable path to solutions. So adaptation really isn't a choice, at least from my perspective. The choice is whether we do it proactively, we prepare in advance for these things, or whether we do it reactively and we're cleaning up a lot of environmental disasters and extreme event disasters. So that's our choice. We have to both mitigate and adapt, but also do it proactively. And adaptation really requires prioritization, because you can't just be afraid of everything. You have to focus on the things that really matter and the things that you can affect. So you need to focus on managing risk and taking advantage of opportunities. And I think Ed's presentation did an excellent job illustrating that. So for people who are making decisions, and of course all of us are making decisions, not just elected officials and water managers, but every citizen is making decisions that affect our future risk, we need to know what to adapt to, especially if it's outside the envelope of prior experience. However, it's pretty hard to have a scientist tell you exactly what the temperature is going to be on June 21st in 2050. And we actually don't need to know that. We just need to know that it is going to get hotter and that we will have more intense heat waves. And we can make decisions on that basis. We don't need to know exactly how hot it will be or how much it will rain on particular days in the future. But because management processes really are based on our knowledge of the past, we do need to have a mindset that really is focused more on the future and understanding what causes these changes and what kinds of trajectories we're going to be experiencing. So we need to know what's a trend and what's variability. You know, when it snows in Tucson, that does not mean that we are not in a changing climate, in case you didn't know that. So there appear to be people who can't distinguish between trends and variability. I won't name any names, but I think they exist. And honestly, we need to get to a place where we do acknowledge that we will still see cold days and cold winters in a warming future, and anticipate the kinds of cascading effects that I mentioned before. So what does it actually mean to adapt to climate change? It means reducing vulnerabilities, and that might mean the underlying vulnerabilities, not just the ones that are connected to climate change. Enhancing preparedness for both those gradual changes and the extreme events. We need to be thinking about all of our resources and managing them as if there actually is a future and that we care about it. And then we have to essentially use common sense about planning to protect our health, safety, and prosperity. So as I mentioned, had the amazing opportunity of working in the White House for 4 years in the Obama administration. I was involved in national adaptation planning. These were some of the principles that we came up with, which seem so obvious and so easy. Obviously, the implementation is not that easy, but integrating the whole idea of climate change into ongoing planning, prioritizing the most vulnerable populations, making sure we're keeping abreast of the best available science, building partnerships so that we're not in it alone as individuals or communities, using a risk management approach as opposed to just being afraid of everything, focusing on the things that might have the biggest impact, protecting ecosystem services, those services that we depend on for food and water, ensuring multiple benefits, meaning looking for where there's an upside to the kinds of investments we might make, evaluating our performance, which is critical. How will we know if we're making any progress if we aren't establishing baselines and really figuring out whether things are changing? And then finally, and I added this one, we didn't have this on the original list, integrating adaptation and mitigation efforts. So if we think about managing risk and managing emissions together as opposed to separately, I think we're going to make a lot more progress and also probably avoid a lot of maladaptation. So I think about adaptation in terms of who's making the decisions and why. And so you really have to understand how people think to do that. And what are the roles of institutions, meaning governments and social circles and clubs like the League of Women Voters, the perceptions of risk, who feels like they're at risk and why do they feel that way? Because that's what motivates them, not the science itself, it's what they perceive about their own risk that motivates them. Practitioner perspectives and training, I mean, how well trained are all the people who help make decisions for society? Many of them are getting more and more sophisticated about this, but we could do a lot better. The decision context, how much flexibility is there to make better decisions, or are there laws or rules or policies that prevent people from doing what really needs to be done? The culture and motivation of the people involved, I mean, clearly, if you have not had training about how to do this and how it can be positive, you might very well fight back against the whole idea of climate adaptation. And then access to timely and relevant data. So many decision makers say, I can't make a decision because I don't have the information. When in fact, the information does exist, they just haven't figured out where it is. But I also see adaptation as reframing, because I do see a lot of reasons why we can't do this. And yet, there are many that we can, and it's really more which lens are you going to look through it with. So managers make decisions with imperfect information all the time, including each one of us. I mean, you invest in the stock market, you decide to have children, you decide whether to plant a tomato or whatever. You make decisions, and you don't know what the outcome of those decisions is going to be. Why is climate change different, and why should it be? It is, we understand the physics, we understand the trends. It's not a crazy thought to think that we actually can find a path forward. We also can do experiments. We can do adaptive management and learn as we go along. We can look for the co-benefits, the things we want to accomplish anyway. We can use small institutional changes, and even just the way we implement existing programs. We can make ourselves much less vulnerable by being smart about implementing existing laws and regulations. We can look for partners, look for economic opportunities. There's businesses out there that are making a ton of money out of the transition from fossil fuels to a renewable economy, and that same thing can be true in adaptation. And then we can use climate change as an excuse to to do integrated planning across the board. And we've seen this happen in many places, but New York City is one of the best examples. They started looking at everything through a climate change lens, and it really led to a much more cohesive and integrated approach to planning and managing risk for the city that was useful in many other applications, not just in the context of climate change. So how do we know whether we're going to succeed in the whole adaptation process? I think focusing our efforts and our investments on measurable improvements in both human and environmental welfare is a pretty important place to start. But there are many other things that we need to think about, and I think most important is the distribution of costs and benefits, because we have seen really serious inequalities develop in the context of the way we currently manage our energy system, and there are ways to fix that, as you heard from Ed. There's the potential for adverse consequences of decisions if we don't think through all of the implications of each decision we make. We need to be monitoring for effectiveness, but we also need to know what kinds of metrics we're going to select to do that. We have to decide how we are going to move from the low regrets, which are the easy options, to the ones that might cost more, and when is it appropriate to do that? How can we avoid crossing thresholds where we really can't go back? And then thinking about environmental justice and equity issues. So I know I'm supposed to be talking about specific things that we can do here, and so I'm going to jump into that briefly before I finish. There is a whole panoply of options, and so if people really think we don't have enough ideas about how to adapt in a changing climate, we have a lot of evidence that that's not the case. So having been a water manager, I probably have a longer list in this category than I do in others, but integrated water resources management, meaning looking at all sources of water holistically, is one. Aquifer management, which we've been actively engaged in for really decades now here in Tucson, is another. Conservation is a big part of our economy already. We've done some component of everything on this list here in Tucson, and it has paid off. We actually are in a place where we can see a difference in terms of what's going on across the southern United States. So this is satellite imagery that actually, or satellite-based analysis that actually shows the difference in the water supply in the groundwater across the southern United States. And you can see that Arizona actually doesn't have a big red blob like most of these other southern states. And that is because of our recharge activities. So we have actually turned the trend around, particularly in Tucson. We're actually seeing water levels rising. So there's many other projects going on locally. One of them is the Lower Santa Cruz River Basin Study that I've been privileged to be engaged with. We're looking at implications of climate change for both the supply and the demand of water in the Tucson Basin, and really thinking about what are the options for reducing overdraft in particular parts of the basin, and also for protecting the environment. And it's great that this is the first time that we've gotten both federal and state governments working together on doing this kind of an analysis. There's a recent publication from the Kresge Foundation looking at climate adaptation across the country in cities. And I think that the graphic here does a good job of illustrating the fact that across the entire United States, they looked at all the leading adaptation efforts in cities and basically concluded that there is no city that has actually done a great job in every category of adaptation, but there are examples of cities across the country that have done especially good jobs in each one of these categories. And together, it sort of builds a complete picture. So we've also seen a lot of effort going on locally. I was at a Sam Hughes Neighborhood Association meeting just this week where there's discussion of how can we really be prepared at the neighborhood level for climate adaptation, and I was impressed by the ideas that they had in mind. Anyway, I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you all for wonderful presentations. We have lots of questions here, and I'm trying to organize them into categories. So please forgive us if I don't call out your question explicitly, but because there's several themes here, and so I'd like to just bring up some of the themes of the questions. Okay, I think perhaps this is a question that Diana can address easily. It's a question about the role of population growth in our problems, and so there was no mention in the IPCC in your comments about population growth, and of course the total human impact on emissions is the number of people and then the average per person emission, those multiplied together. So could you address this issue of population?
Certainly. Well, in the report itself, when we talk about the what you could call the drivers of increasing emissions in different countries, we look at a variety of factors, and one is absolute population numbers, another is per capita consumption, but it's also the sort of technologies that are being used, because you can have increased consumption without it being associated with more greenhouse gas emissions. But we don't talk about controlling population growth as a high priority solution, because that's already happening. Not in the IPCC report, but in a lot of other academic work now, people are reporting that population growth is slowing far faster than anybody ever thought it would. And that's because women all over the world have reproductive choice in most countries, but it's not really just that. It's that the education of women and girls is increasing, employment opportunities are increasing, and with all of those improvements in the status of women, women throughout the world are choosing to have less children. So if we take our neighbor Mexico, over just the last 50 years, the number of children that women are choosing to have has fallen from 6 to 4 to 2. And once you get below 2, then population actually starts to shrink. So in almost all countries of the world, not every single one, there are a couple of exceptions, the population growth rate is slowing. There is some momentum, but the UN has forecast that actually population growth could level off by the middle of the century, by 2050, and start to decline. And there isn't a lot that policymakers need to do to continue to support that, as long as you maintain education for women, reproductive rights for women. And if you're interested in this question, my friend Catherine Wilkinson has just done a very good TED talk, because Project Drawdown, which is looking at emissions, all the different ways to reduce emissions, similar to what Ed talked about, Project Drawdown lists amongst the top 10 priorities is educating women and girls and maintaining reproductive rights. And Catherine's done a very nice TED talk on how well women have done already, that they've almost sorted the problem out of population growth, but we need to maintain this momentum where women and men are choosing that the optimum population size is actually 2, and that really means, I guess the bottom line is, I'm not that worried about population growth if we can maintain those other issues. I'm much more concerned about increased per capita consumption, because it depends on who's having those children. A child born in the US will have like 12 times the greenhouse gas emissions of a child born in Bangladesh. So consumption is what I believe we need to focus on, and I believe the science is showing that as well.
Thank you. Just a comment that we have some questions about where you can get information about the IPCC report, and Diana just mentioned the Drawdown, Project Drawdown. The links to those sources are given on the back of the handout that was on the seat of your chair. So I think you can find more information in the links here. Also, there are, Diana, I think all three of you brought some brochures, and there are copies of those on the table in the back, so you can get more specific information that they brought with those brochures. So I encourage you to take a look at that when you go out. This is a wonderful question. And that question is, can the panelists ask one question of each other?
I'm going to ask Ed how you translated yourself from being a person who studied planetary issues to, extraplanetary to this planet.
Right. Well, actually, so I was involved with the OSIRIS-REx project before I retired, and that's a mission that's going to an asteroid. And some of you have probably seen some of the pictures of asteroid Bennu from the OSIRIS-REx spacecraft. It's actually fascinating. If you're a planetary scientist, understanding these sorts of things lead to a lot of insights about the planet Earth. But if you look at it, it is a cold, dead, little gray world. And if you look at a picture of the Earth, it is a beautiful, luscious home where we all live. And I've felt for a long time that I needed to be able to spend more time working on that issue. And the demands of my career really didn't let me take the time out to do that. So I felt after launch, it was a good time to move on and start working on climate issues. So that's what it's all about for me.
I'm going to ask Ed one too, because Kathy and I talk all the time, but he didn't talk about this, which is, are there examples of other countries that have successfully implemented Fee and Dividend and reduced their emissions?
Thank you. That was one of the questions I was going to ask if you didn't.
So I think probably the one that I think about most often is British Columbia. They've actually had a carbon fee and dividend program in place for a while. They do not have a steadily ascending fee on fossil fuels, but they have seen a drop in the use of fossil fuels within BC, and they have seen no apparent economic damage as a result of that. In fact, the program is quite popular. There are other countries that actually have fossil fuel fees in place, but they're quite low. And we think that the reason for that is probably because of the impact on international trade. And this is where the border adjustment would make a big difference. If we put a border adjustment in place, if we institute a carbon fee and dividend program in this country, and then put a border adjustment in place, that means that, say, let's just use an example, Chile exporting copper to the United States is going to start paying a tariff on copper to bring it up to the increased cost of energy associated with making copper domestically. Well, that actually, so if you're Chile, you're thinking, well, you know, we could give the Americans that tariff when we send our copper into the United States, or we could just raise our own fossil fuel price and keep it at home. So that's what a border adjustment would do. There are a lot of countries that actually have these in place, but they're too low, and the implementation of a more aggressive program here in the United States, a large trader with the rest of the world, would probably cause these other countries to step up and raise their prices as well. So I guess it's my turn for a question, and I would say, I'd like to ask Kathy a question. You've been doing the adaptation work for some time, which is really wonderful because a lot of the effects are baked in, so to speak, no pun intended. How are you seeing communities like Tucson respond? I mean, are you seeing the cities doing a pretty good job in terms of adaptation work?
Well, clearly there is a big range in terms of what the cities are doing, but especially actually as a result of the fact that the federal government has taken a major step back from engagement in managing climate issues, both adaptation and mitigation. We've seen cities really become heroes across the country. I think it's 650 mayors or something have stepped up and really sort of focusing on making their own cities more resilient and managing emissions. So most of the major cities along the coast in particular seem to be highly motivated for reasons that are fairly obvious. And many in the interior are not clear as doing quite as well. That being said, Flagstaff and Tucson, I think, are both very well known for what they've achieved, and even Phoenix has been quite active dealing with issues like urban heat island and so forth. So there is progress, but it would be much greater if we had some kind of national coordination, if we had more support for adaptation, which is actually something that I spend most of my quote-unquote free time on, is trying to solve this problem at bigger scales, because we just can't all individually be focusing on this and trying to solve such a big problem. We need to have much more collective action and more support from the federal government.
And that leads into another class of questions. Everybody is interested in getting ideas for how we change the national, at least the public rhetoric about climate change. So some of the questions along these lines were how to address climate skeptics, and I think this might be a question for Diana.
Well, I think all three of us have experienced discussions with climate skeptics. I actually think that the debate has changed a bit since I've been in this field for a very long time. There used to be fairly significant disagreements about the science and whether warming was happening. I believe that that has reduced. There are still a few people who have unusual theories about what's happening with the climate, but many people who used to be skeptical are now, including politicians, are now accepting that global warming is happening. The skepticism is more about the solutions. And for example, should we get rid of fossil fuels immediately? Debates about tax or fee and dividend. It's actually, I mean, there's so much information now to respond to a skeptic. There are many websites which actually have suggestions on how to discuss with a skeptic. But I will usually start by asking questions to find out where the disagreement is. Is it about really a disagreement about the solutions, or is there a fundamental disagreement about the science? And is it that they think it's a whole conspiracy theory, in which case I probably stop talking to them, especially if they think I'm being paid to say stuff. Some of them are actually. There are people who are paid skeptics. But oftentimes there is a middle ground where you can sort of say, yes, there is uncertainty, but you know, it's uncertain about whether your house is going to catch on fire, but you still take out home insurance, for example. You can find some ways to discuss it. But do you have a...
Yeah, I'd like to just add a couple of things. You know, we talk with politicians, we talk with folks on the street, so we do encounter climate skepticism. Oftentimes I think that as Diana pointed out, that actually may be something else that's going on. So for instance, it may be a person believes that if it's a big government solution, that they're more afraid of a big government solution than they are the climate change problem itself. There's a whole variety of things. In fact, I think the last couple of years of public discussion have probably illuminated this topic a lot. That facts aren't necessarily the reason we make choices. That oftentimes there's something more complicated and going on, and that it's important for us to be able to study this and understand what is it that makes us take sides on an issue. This is an area where the Citizens Climate Lobby spends a lot of time training its members on how to have a civil conversation, a conversation that doesn't degenerate into an argument. And also they drive home the fact that I'm not going to change your mind, you are. And so how can I put you in a place that allows you to transform your thinking on something? And so there's some skill involved in doing that. It's not a particularly difficult thing, it takes some practice, but it's something we would probably all be well advised to spend a little time working on.
I'll just add that sort of where you stand depends on where you sit. And if you start by recognizing where other people are coming from, which is really what Diana said as well, engage people in a conversation, understand why they're saying what they're saying, really listen to them, and acknowledge them as people who have a right to have an opinion. That's a very different starting place than just arguing. And so I think we all need to treat each other as human beings first and people who disagree second, and that can really help. That being said, when you have two completely different sources of information, I think that is part of what our problem is. We've got a major segment of the population in the United States that gets its information from Fox News and other sources that are not science-based. And they don't actually know that that's true. That's just where they get their information. And so we have two complete different fact sets. It's not surprising that we have almost nothing in the middle, because there are very few fact sets in the middle. It's very distinct. So we need to do something about helping people understand that there are other sources of information.
And if I could just add a point about what we know about Arizonans as a whole, there was, U of A did a survey a few years ago on how Arizonans understood climate change, and the Yale project surveys every 3 months about how American views of climate change are shifting or not. And the vast majority of Arizonans think that climate change is happening, and also a majority want the government to do something about it. And that is both Republicans and Democrats and independents. So whilst not everybody thinks it's happening, in terms of our democracy, the majority do think it's happening and do want something done about it. And in terms of the national reports on Arizonan attitudes, it suggests there's been a shift. And if you ask people in Arizona about solar energy, it's like 90% support for moving to solar energy. And again, a lot of bipartisan support. So I think sometimes our elected officials are not representing what the public views actually are.
And so here, this feeds into some questions about, I think this is one for Ed. He said, well, why not use the initiative process and other grassroots action in addition to top-down contacting members of Congress? So I think this is a question about what sort of local initiatives will help move Arizona along in dealing with this issue.
Sure. Well, I'm certainly a big supporter of the initiative process. I think that it has potential. Of course, with Citizens Climate Lobby, we try to focus on national issues because we feel that ultimately a national solution is required to provide the uniformity that business needs in order to respond in an economic and market-based way. Nevertheless, there's room for states doing things on their own, and they are actually doing things on their own. And there's actually an incentive for states to not, well, I should say, there's an incentive to business for states not to do that independently, because what's likely to happen is if every state passed laws to somehow regulate climate change, you would probably have 50 independent sets of laws that would be difficult to adapt to. Now, from a standpoint of somebody who wants to see change, that might be a good thing, because at some point the oil companies and the energy companies would say, enough already, uncle, we'll take a federal solution to solve this problem rather than have 50 sets of independent solutions. So from a strategy perspective, state-based solutions may be very effective in moving us along to what we need, which is a government, a national solution, and ultimately solutions that pan out worldwide.
But if you're California, which is such an economic powerhouse, state initiatives in California really can affect the whole US and global emissions, because aren't they like the 11th biggest economy in the world?
Actually, the fifth, right, so they're huge.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
yeah.
And California, of course, is very forward in terms of acting on climate. And when I'm traveling around the world and people ask me, well, the US, you know, you're not doing anything anymore, I start talking about California.
There are several questions that I think relate to how say a carbon tax and dividend would make this economic change, or fee, excuse me, fee, carbon fee and dividend. How exactly would that work to change the whole economy and make it perhaps more steady state and
Right.
sustainable? So I think these are questions about how would this work, and so Ed, if you could perhaps suggest some sources of information.
Well, I would say probably the first place to go would be the Citizens Climate Lobby website, because they have a lot of, so we're very much a data-driven organization. We adapt to new truths. We don't think that there's any value in pushing something that we find out is not right. So I would say start there, because we have a lot of economic modeling data there. There's also a very good book called The Case for a Carbon Tax. I would also suggest that some literature searches, you would find, for instance, that there's been a lot of work done by leading economists across the country. Just recently, there was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal signed by 21 Nobel Prize winning economists, as well as all the former heads of the Federal Reserve, saying a carbon fee and dividend program would really be the simplest, most straightforward way to do this. I would also point out, there was recently an experiment done in Berkeley where they didn't want to have expensive soda. They didn't want sugar-filled sodas being sold in their town. So they slapped a 50% tax on it, and the sale of soda dropped through the floor. This is what happens when things get more expensive. People look for alternatives. Now, in the case of what happened in Berkeley, is people went outside Berkeley and bought their soda somewhere else. But the point is that we have a lot of data that shows that when prices go up, people react to prices. And I don't just it's not just the buyers who react. It's the market that looks at it and says, I see a new opportunity. I see the fact that this source of energy is now expensive, but suddenly other sources of energy become more attractive. Or I find that suddenly the potential for selling appliances that save energy just went up. So one of the things that we count on is the fact that we have a very efficient marketplace in this country that gets rid of bad ideas very quickly and promotes good ideas. And we also have capital markets, money in this country, that far exceed our potential to tax individuals. There is a lot of money sitting on the sidelines that's just waiting for good ideas to come along and people to invest in. So I would say start at the Citizens Climate Lobby website and work out from there. But if you Google carbon tax, you'll see a lot of research. Look for the book, The Case for a Carbon Tax. That's probably the best, most succinct source that I've found that's helpful.
Thank you, Ed. And there were several questions asking Kathy. Really, I think you can address this. For more specifics about Tucson local initiatives that can be supported that are moving in the right direction, can you give people an idea of where they can go to find out about these neighborhood programs or water harvesting or whatnot?
I'm actually probably not as well informed about that as many people in this room are, but I do know that the city and the county have both engaged in sustainability efforts. The county, for example, just passed a whole new program focused on sustainability that you can check online. There are neighborhood associations like the Sam Hughes Neighborhood Association that has been, directly addressing the issue of managing heat. And of course, Tucson Water itself has been very actively engaged in not only sort of the management of water in the context of a shrinking water supply situation, but also the negotiations working with on the Colorado River drought contingency plan and so forth. So I think at multiple scales, there's a lot of effort going on in the community. But I know Barbara Warren is sitting over there, and she's at every meeting I go to, and she might know the answer to that better than I do. And I know Trace is back there. Anyway, there's many people who go to even more community meetings than I do, and might be able to help.
And we need to ask the mayor's candidates about both emissions reductions and climate adaptation in Tucson. I think 7 of them will be willing to talk about it, so we need to ask them the questions so that we hear what they will do if elected mayor.
Thank you. And just looking at the audience, I think that one of these questions everyone will be interested in: what can we do to get more younger people invested in this issue? So, any ideas?
Well, first of all, let me acknowledge the amazing worldwide initiative movement yesterday.
Nothing in Tucson.
Actually, there were some actions in Tucson, but they didn't come in front of City Hall. Some schools and some university classes did take a moment to recognize what was happening. And we do, I teach a large freshman class at U of A, and those students are very concerned about climate change. Some of them are quite angry in the same way that Greta Thunberg and others are at our generation for not having done something about it. And they're very interested in solutions. So they're not in this room or some of the other rooms I speak to, but I do a survey at the beginning of class, and I had not one climate skeptic. I have students who ask question after question. And then you had an experience, right, with young people recently?
Yes, I've spoken at a couple of high schools recently and been very heartened by the experience. I spoke at BASIS this week, and they have a STEM education club, and I think there were 30 kids who stayed late that day until 5 o'clock to hear my talk, and they were really interested in not just what I was saying, but also my career. And I heard back from some of them later on saying that, what I was talking about was what they wanted to do with their lives. But I was just absolutely blown away by the quality of the questions that they asked. I honestly think that they probably don't need an undergraduate education. I mean, they actually were that good that they were sort of at the level of a senior at the university. So if you've got people like that, very excited, who are very smart, there's a lot of hope there. But we do need to empower them, and there need to be resources, and there need to be places that they can actually do what they want to do. I think many of them don't know what path. One of them said to me, "How can I help you do your work?" And I said, "I'll be in touch shortly." Anyway, so I do think there is a lot of hope, and it isn't that they don't care. There are lots of young people who do.
I would just add also that Citizens Climate Lobby does a lot of visiting with our members of Congress, both in Washington, D.C. and in district. It's our local policy to always try to take along a student when we visit a congressman's office here. And because we believe that the answer will lie in democracy, and we have to show to students that democracy is the right way to do this. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is make voters out of them and make them convinced that they need to get out on election day, primaries, as well as the generals, understand who's running, and they get out there and vote. But they have to see democracy working. And I think that when you do visit with a congressperson, when you do visit with a senator, you start to understand that it's a nuanced problem, that they're trying to balance a lot of issues. We've really never had a meeting with a congressman. I personally have never had a meeting with a congressman where I didn't feel coming away that they understood and they were struggling in some fashion to try to find ways to solve this problem.
Well, let's thank our excellent speakers, and thank you all for